The United States just voted alongside North Korea, Russia, and a few other countries in not condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even China sat this one out.
Just take a look at this roster. At the far right, you'll see that, yes, the United States voted red, voted against. The reasoning for this was expressed by the U.S. Deputy Ambassador, Dorothy Shea. She said the condemnations and the demanding of the withdrawal of Russian troops have failed to stop the war, which has now dragged on for far too long and at far too terrible a cost to the people in Ukraine and Russia and beyond. Let's go over a very simple chronology of events. In February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine based on the claim that the Ukrainians were butchering ethnic Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk, and the culprits were Nazi sympathizers or Ukrainian Nazis. Now, I'm going to be quoting from the Rand Institute, their book, The Denazify Life, just the first page. Putin claimed that Ukraine was led by far-right nationalists and neo-Nazis, and that the purpose of Russia's invasion was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. For about 6 months, that argument was completely debunked for the sheer fact that, of course, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was Jewish, but Russia has an even larger Nazi problem than Ukraine. So then Putin and his sympathizers began using the argument of the encroachment of NATO, because according to Russia and the other propagandists, the United States violated its promise to never have NATO expand 1 inch eastward after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. Now, the origin of this violated promise comes from the Secretary of the State at the time, James Baker, who worked under George Bush, when he promised Gorbachev that under a reunified Germany, NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, as you could see in the paragraph I show. Now, I have read every communication and transcript between the United States government and the former USSR during this time period of the reunification of Germany and the question of whether or not NATO expands. And nowhere in any of these communications between the United States and the USSR at that time did anyone promise that NATO would never expand eastward. This was regarding the reunification of Germany and the immediate future. Because the greatest concern at the time was the reunification of Germany, which the USSR was terrified of, since Germany has a habit of conquering or at least invading and inflicting heavy losses against Russia. And let's have common sense when it comes to international law. There is no such thing as a verbal assurance that would be guaranteed past any presidential administration. So if the United States actually made a promise to not expand NATO anywhere past Germany, then they would have had to have issued a formal treaty that would have endured past the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and what have you. Now, looking at the Unification Treaty of Germany is very simple. You just have to do a Google search. And when you read the treaty, you will see in none of the articles, in no stipulation, did it say that NATO would never expand. But the most damning and damaging fact that takes away the Russian argument of being against NATO expansion is something that happened in 1975. The Helsinki Accords, which took place in 1975, also called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Final Act. Now, you have to pay attention to the wording of this paragraph on the 7th page of this act regarding the participating nations, which includes every nation in Europe along with the USSR, which includes Ukraine. Regarding the participating nations, please read with me. They also have the right to belong or not to belong to international organizations, to be or not to be a party to bilateral or multilateral treaties, including the right to be or not to be a party to treaties of alliance. They also have the right to neutrality. Remember that NATO is an alliance, and this accord, which was agreed upon by every country, said that any of these countries get to determine who they ally with. Now, in the same conversation between James Baker and Gorbachev, the Helsinki Agreement comes up, where Gorbachev says, if a united Germany, based on the principle of the freedom of choice, uses its right to choose the organization it wants to belong to, and decides to become a member of the Warsaw Pact, will you be able to give your consent to that? And then Baker says, We will say that, in our opinion, it is the wrong decision from the point of view of future stability. However, we will uphold the Helsinki principles. And Gorbachev was satisfied with that. And the Helsinki Agreement still holds true to this day, which Russia is in complete violation of. And that dethrones the anti-NATO argument as well, because every single country that has requested to join NATO was allowed to by this Helsinki Accord. But now the argument is entirely against Ukraine, claiming that Ukraine has allowed this war to continue for far too long, 3 years and a couple days. The only reason why this war has lasted for as long as it has, 3 years and a couple days, is because Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is holding about 20% of Ukraine's territory, and they have killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, most of them citizens. And it is only because of the bravery of Ukraine's troops and the aid that the United States and the European Union and other countries were giving to Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't been letting this war continue for 3 years. They have been lasting against an aggressive country that has been trying to annihilate them. Suggesting that Ukraine be reasonable and just surrender to the Russians would be like telling Americans after September 11th, 2001, to give away some land or make concessions to the people who destroyed the Twin Towers. All of these countries that joined NATO weren't forced to join, and it's not like NATO in and of itself is a government. NATO didn't annex any territory, unlike Russia when they annexed parts of Moldova in the 1990s, northern Georgia in the 2000s, and right now annexing Ukraine, at least Crimea, and they're trying to get their hands on the Donbass. Now, if you read NATO's statement on enlargement and open door, you'll see that not one country like the United States or the UK or any few nations can decide whether or not someone else gets to join NATO. It has to be enlarged by unanimous agreement, meaning all 31 or 32 nations have to agree upon it. Remember, after Russia's invasion in 2022, Finland and Sweden both wanted to join NATO quickly, but that was held up by both Turkey and Hungary, who did not want that to happen without some concessions being made. Then there is the process of accession. If you want to read the paragraph, it pretty much just says that countries have to request first to join NATO, and then they are invited to begin a dialogue with the alliance as to why and how that could happen. Aspiring countries that want to join NATO have to participate in the Membership Action Plan. And even if they participate in it, that doesn't guarantee membership of this alliance. The criterion for joining NATO includes a functioning democratic political system based on a market economy, fair treatment of minority populations, a commitment to resolve conflicts peacefully, an ability and willingness to make military contributions to NATO operations, and a commitment to democratic civil-military relations and institutions. Only with those requirements being fulfilled is a country allowed to join the ranks of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There is no military takeover. So all of the reasons that Russian leadership and Russian sympathizers have supplied for why they invaded Ukraine based off of NATO's ascension is nonsense. It's easily debunked. Now, while the bulk of the blame for Ukraine's invasion by Russia can be laid at Russia's feet, NATO, especially the United States, plays a major part in this. When the Soviet Union fell, a huge bulk of their nuclear weapons were in Ukraine, and Ukraine refused to give them up because they feared further Russian aggression in the future. So in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum took place. It was also called the Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Look at the second article in this referendum where it says the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the US reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Invading a country, especially one much weaker and smaller than yours, is not an act of self-defense. But let's look at Article 4. That's more important. All these countries, I'm not going to say them out loud again, reaffirm their commitment to seek immediate UN Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapon state party to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. If Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. Now, say what you will about Russia, but the United States is bound by international law to provide assistance to Ukraine in order to help them with what's going on today. Remember that Ukraine has not been under attack since 2022. It's been under attack, under siege, since 2014, when Russia attacked and then annexed Crimea. Yes, the US and NATO countries have given support to Ukraine, but barely the support needed to keep Russian forces out and from invading any further. Russia's attacking and annexing of Crimea was a clear violation of the Budapest memorandum, and the lack of support that Ukraine received from the West is another violation, even more egregious. Before the United States and the EU began to heavily sanction Russia, they traded with that country, and Europe exported their energy needs to Russia for 8 years while Crimea was in Russian hands. And this long sustained conflict in Ukraine for 11 years is not just the fault of the EU, it is the fault of the Obama administration for not giving immediate lethal support to Ukraine right upon the Russian invasion. It is a failure of the Trump administration for the same reason, and it is an even greater failure of the Biden administration, because when Russia upped the ante, NATO, of course led by the US, was still keeping Ukraine on a leash from effectively defending itself. Obama's initial fear in 2014 to not escalate this conflict into a war is maybe the greatest reason why we are in the situation that we are in, and Ukraine has been thrown to the wolves by this current administration. While the Trump administration's claims that Zelensky is a dictator or that Ukraine started the war are completely unfounded, they do have a point when they say that previous UN resolutions condemning Russia and demanding the withdrawal of Russian troops have failed to stop the war. They are absolutely right in that failure, because for 11 years, the UN passed resolutions. America condemned Russia, so did the rest of Europe, so did most of the world, and Ukraine was still under siege. Ukraine received a mere trickle of aid for the first 8 years of this conflict, and they got a substantial increase after 2022, but it wasn't enough to win the war. In fact, when Ukraine started to get too successful during this war, the United States and the rest of NATO started holding them back. Ukraine successfully invaded Kursk, and they are still holding the Russian troops off. Yet during the initial invasion of August of 2024, the United States would not let Ukraine strike deep into Russia with drones and other missiles. NATO consistently delayed giving Ukraine F-16s and other essential means of defending themselves. While China is Russia's biggest fan and financial backer for this war in Ukraine, NATO has been Russia's greatest protector, and it's NATO's holding Ukraine on a leash that made this war last so long, and that made Ukraine unable to make significant gains to chase the Russians out. And now, everything that Ukraine fought for, all of the money that NATO and the United States gave to Ukraine, seems to have been a waste of Russian and Ukrainian lives. Fortunately, even though the United States has voted with Russia alongside North Korea and turned their back on Ukraine, that doesn't mean Ukraine is finished. It is up to Ukraine to decide whether or not they surrender, and it is up to the rest of NATO in the EU to decide whether or not they support Ukraine. And it looks like the EU is prepared to give 700 billion euros in military aid to Ukraine. That's about 730 billion US dollars. UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer has said he is willing to put his own troops into Ukraine, and I would not be surprised if Poland and other countries chose to do the same. The UK, right now, on its own, could defeat Russia for the sheer fact that Russia lost over 800,000 troops and tens of billions of dollars of military equipment in this war so far. Also, the UK and the US special forces have so heavily infiltrated the Russian military and overall infrastructure that these people know more about what's going on inside Russia's armed forces than they do with Ukraine's. But if Russia does attack the UK, they are not fighting that one country, they are fighting 31 other NATO countries that would be brought in due to the invocation of Article 5. If you look at NATO's total military budget, you see for the year 2024, it exceeds $1.474 trillion. Now, $900 billion accounts for U.S. military spending, but the other $574 billion is NATO's. That's more than 6 times Russia's former 2023 budget of $80 billion. There are reports saying that in 2025, Russia's military budget will be closer to $200 billion for the year. And that is still not even half of NATO's budget, and most of the NATO countries don't even match the 2% of GDP required for spending on defense. NATO Europe would have a clear advantage against Russia because they have a larger population to draw from, they have a bigger budget, and they have better trained troops. Russia has the advantage for being a very commodity-rich country, and they have the financial backing of China. They could produce a lot of their own food and a lot of their own energy, which Europe cannot boast the same. If NATO Europe did switch to a wartime economy as quickly as they could, they would need to be consuming a lot more oil, natural gas, and other precious metals, which would most likely be supplied by the United States. While Europe is clearly frustrated with the United States, and they're probably going to get more frustrated, they would be constrained to get a lot of the commodities they need from the US in order to take on Russia, because China does not have a vested interest in trading with Europe at the expense of their Russian ally for now.
To sum this all up, it doesn't look very good on the world stage that the United States did such a 180-degree turn against their major allies, and it leaves room to make the US or the entire NATO alliance a lot strategically weaker than it's possibly ever been. And while the Trump administration has a very good point stating the fact that this war has gone on for far too long despite all of the UN resolutions and all of the verbal and slow trickles of support to Ukraine, the most strategically effective way, in my opinion, was for all of NATO to have galvanized very quickly in 2014 to help Ukraine however Ukraine needed it.
Now, wonderful people, if you found my post useful or helpful, please give me a subscribe onto my YouTube, and if you want to support me, click on my link tree, which is on my YouTube profile, and consider subscribing to my Patreon. I have 384,000 followers on TikTok. I have about 10,300 on YouTube, but I'm trying to get my YouTube numbers higher than my TikTok numbers, so let's get that going. Thanks for watching.